high above the historic town of Beechworth in Victoria, Australia, sits a place of immense sorrow and lingering madness known as Mayday Hills Asylum. This sprawling complex served as a final destination for thousands of souls who were deemed unfit for society during the 19th century. Its grand Italianate architecture masks a dark history filled with neglect and despair that permeates the very soil of the grounds. Visitors today often report an overwhelming sense of dread the moment they step onto the property. The silence here is heavy and thick, like a wool blanket that suffocates sound and hope alike. It is a location where the line between the living and the dead has been blurred by decades of suffering. The buildings stand as silent witnesses to a time when mental health was misunderstood and often treated with cruelty. Founded in the year 1867, the asylum was originally named the Beechworth Lunatic Asylum. It was built during the height of the Gold Rush era, when the population of Victoria was exploding with fortune seekers. The government needed a place to house the growing number of people who cracked under the pressure of the harsh Australian frontier. Perched upon a hill, the institution was designed to be a self-contained village that could operate independently from the outside world. The location was chosen specifically for its altitude, as doctors believed the fresh mountain air would cleanse the minds of the afflicted. However, the isolation only served to further detach the patients from reality and their loved ones. One of the most striking features of Mayday Hills is the perimeter boundary, known as the Ha-Ha Walls. From the outside, the gardens look open and inviting, with an uninterrupted view of the spectacular countryside. However, from the inside, the ground slopes down sharply to a deep trench reinforced by a steep brick wall. This architectural trick allowed the patients to see the world, but prevented them from ever reaching it. It was a psychological torment that offered the illusion of freedom while ensuring absolute confinement. Many patients spent hours staring over these walls at a life they could no longer touch. The design represents the cruel duality of the asylum, where beauty and imprisonment walked hand in hand. Admission to the asylum was frighteningly easy during the Victorian era, and often required only the signatures of two people. A husband could sign away a wife who was deemed too emotional, or a family could commit an elderly relative who had become a burden. Once a person entered the gates of Mayday Hills, it was incredibly difficult to ever leave. The stigma attached to mental illness meant that families often abandoned their relatives entirely. Patients were stripped of their identities and their personal belongings upon arrival. They were issued a uniform and a number, effectively erasing who they were before. This loss of self was the first step in a long descent into institutional darkness. The asylum was built to house around 400 patients, At its peak, it held over 1,200 people. The overcrowding created a breeding ground for disease and violence within the wards. Beds were crammed into corridors and common rooms, leaving no space for privacy or peace. The noise was constant, with the screams of the disturbed echoing off the hard plaster walls day and night. Staff members were overwhelmed and underqualified to deal with the sheer volume of human misery. In these cramped conditions, the tension was palpable, and fights would break out over the smallest provocations. The atmosphere was charged with a frantic energy that still seems to vibrate within the empty halls today. Winters in Beechworth are known for being biting and cold, and the asylum offered little protection against the elements. The high ceilings, which gave the building its grandeur, also made it impossible to heat effectively. Patients huddled together for warmth under thin blankets, while the frost crept across the windows. Pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses claimed many lives during the long winter months. The cold was not just physical, but emotional, as the lack of compassion from the overworked staff left patients feeling abandoned. Those who survived the winters emerged harder and more broken than before. The chill that visitors feel today is often described as a spectral remnant of those freezing nights. Among the many figures who walked these halls, none is more feared in death than Matron Sharpe. She was a stern and imposing woman who ran the female wards with an iron fist during the early 20th century. Her presence was enough to silence a room of unruly patients instantly. She was known to be meticulous and demanded absolute order in an environment defined by chaos. Matron Sharpe did not tolerate disobedience, and her punishments were swift and severe. Even in death, she is said to patrol the corridors, ensuring that the asylum remains under her control. Many witnesses claim to see a gray lady in an old-fashioned nurse uniform watching them from the shadows. The male wards were patrolled by a group of staff members known notoriously as the Greencoats. These men were named for the distinctive green jackets they wore as part of their uniform. They were not medical professionals, but rather strong men hired to keep the peace through intimidation and force. The Greencoats were feared by the patients for their brutality and lack of empathy. They carried heavy keys that they used as weapons to subdue anyone who acted out. The sound of their heavy boots marching down the hallway was a signal for patients to scatter and hide. Their dark legacy is etched into the memories of the asylum history. Stories of the Greencoats' cruelty are numerous and chilling, often involving beatings that went unreported. They operated with impunity, knowing that the word of a lunatic would never be believed over that of a guard. Patients who crossed the Greencoats would often disappear into solitary confinement for days on end. These isolation cells were dark, damp, and terrifyingly small spaces where a person was left alone with their demons. The psychological scars inflicted by these men ran deeper than any physical wound. Ghost hunters today often report feeling an aggressive male energy in the areas where the Greencoats once reigned. It is believed that their spirits are still trapping the souls of patients within these walls. One of the most famous patients to reside at Mayday Hills was James Kelly, the uncle of the bushranger Ned Kelly. He spent a significant portion of his life confined within the asylum. After burning down a house belonging to his sister-in-law, James was known to be a difficult man, and his time at the institution was marked by defiance. He lived to be very old and died within the walls of the asylum, like so many others. His spirit is said to linger near the cottage where he spent his final years. Visitors often report the smell of tobacco smoke in areas where no one is smoking. It is a subtle reminder that some personalities are too strong to be extinguished by death. Work was considered a form of therapy at Mayday Hills, and patients were required to labor in the kitchens and laundries. The kitchen was a cavernous space where food was prepared for over 1,000 people daily. It was hot and dangerous work, involving heavy cauldrons and sharp utensils. Despite the risks, patients were often left unsupervised for long periods. The sheer scale of the operation meant that individuals became nothing more than cogs in a machine. The mundane repetition of peeling potatoes or scrubbing floors became their entire existence. Today, the kitchen area is cold and silent, but some say they can still hear the clatter of pots and pans. The gardens of Mayday Hills are remarkably beautiful, having been planted by the same curators who designed the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. Exotic trees and rare plants were brought in to create a soothing environment for the troubled minds. Massive oak trees line the avenues, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns. However, this beauty masked the reality that the patients were essentially slave labor used to maintain the grounds. They worked from sunrise to sunset in all weather conditions to keep the asylum looking pristine. The contrast between the lush greenery and the misery of the workers is a tragic irony. The trees have witnessed generations of sorrow and stand as silent sentinels. Nighttime at the asylum brings a different kind of terror that settles deep in the bones. As the sun sets behind the hills, the long corridors are plunged into shadow. During its operation, the nights were filled with the sounds of weeping and shouting from the locked rooms. Staff members on the night shift often dreaded walking the rounds alone. The flickering gas lights played tricks on the eyes, making it seem as if the shadows were moving. Today, the darkness feels alive and watchful to those who dare to enter after dark. Flashlights often fail inexplicably, and batteries drain at an accelerated rate. The morgue at Mayday Hills was a busy place, as death was a common occurrence within the institution. Bodies were moved quietly to to this small, detached building to avoid upsetting the other patients. The cold stone slabs held the remains of those who had succumbed to illness, old age, or despair. For many, the morgue was the only way out of the asylum. It is a place of profound stillness, where the air feels significantly colder than the surrounding area. Visitors often report feeling a sudden wave of nausea or dizziness when stepping inside. It is as if the energy of death has permanently stained the brickwork. Over 3,000 people died at Mayday Hills during its 128 years of operation, because many patients were abandoned by their families. Their bodies went unclaimed. These forgotten souls were buried in unmarked graves in the nearby cemetery. They were laid to rest without headstones or ceremonies, their names recorded only in dusty ledgers. This lack of recognition in death is believed to be a major reason why the spirits are so restless. They wander the grounds, seeking the acknowledgement they were denied in life. The tragedy of their anonymous burial adds a layer of profound sadness to the haunting. The treatments administered at the asylum evolved over the decades, but many were barbaric by modern standards. In the early days, restraint was the primary method of control, involving straitjackets and padded cells. As psychiatry advanced, new horrors were introduced under the guise of medical progress. Electroconvulsive therapy was used extensively, often without anesthetic or muscle relaxants. The shock would induce violent seizures that could break bones and shatter teeth. Patients lived in terror of being sent for treatment, knowing it would bring immense pain. The echoes of their screams seemed to be trapped within the treatment rooms. Another controversial procedure performed was the lobotomy, which severed connections in the brain to make patients docile. It was seen as a cure for aggression, but often left the person in a vegetative state. The operating rooms where these surgeries took place are some of the most active paranormal hotspots. The energy here is frantic and confused, reflecting the shattered minds of the victims. People often report sharp headaches or a feeling of pressure in their temples when entering these spaces. It is a visceral reminder of the physical damage inflicted in the name of medicine. The ghosts here are not just restless, they are damaged. The staff themselves were often prisoners of the institution in their own way. Nurses and orderlies lived on the grounds and were discouraged from mixing with the townspeople of Beechworth. This isolation created a unique subculture within the asylum walls. They lived and breathed the asylum atmosphere 24 hours a day. The constant exposure to madness took a toll on their own mental health. Alcoholism and depression were common among the employees, who struggled to cope with the grim reality of their work. Their spirits, too, are said to be trapped, bound to the place that consumed their lives. The Bijou Theatre was built to provide entertainment for the patients and staff. It hosted dances, concerts, and religious services, in an attempt to normalize life at the institution. However, the joy experienced here was always fleeting and superficial. Patients were watched closely by guards, even while they were supposed to be having fun. A sudden outburst during a performance would result in immediate removal and punishment. The theater stands today as a hollow shell of forced happiness. Some visitors claim to hear the faint sound of a piano playing disjointed melodies in the empty hall. Fire was a constant fear at Mayday Hills due to the age of the buildings and the wooden interiors. The thought of being trapped in a burning building while locked in a cell terrified the patients. There were several close calls over the years that caused panic throughout the wards. The smell of smoke is a common phantom scent reported by paranormal investigators. It is a sensory manifestation of the anxiety that plagued the residents. The fear of fire represents the ultimate loss of control in a place where control was everything. It adds an elemental danger to the list of terrors associated with the asylum. When the asylum finally closed its doors in 1995, it marked the end of an era. The closure was a long process, as patients were moved to smaller community-based facilities. When the last bus left, the grounds fell silent for the first time in over a century. However, the buildings were not emptied entirely of their contents. Furniture, files, and medical equipment were left behind, as if the staff had just stepped out for a break. This sudden abandonment preserved the atmosphere of the asylum, freezing it in time. The decay that followed was slow and graceful, reclaiming the structures. In the years following the closure, the site became a magnet for urban explorers and vandals. People broke in to see the remains of the asylum and to experience the thrill of the forbidden. Graffiti appeared on the walls, and windows were smashed by careless intruders. Despite the vandalism, the core atmosphere of the place remained unshaken. The spirits seemed to retreat into the shadows, waiting for the noise to settle. The site was eventually purchased and repurposed, but the reputation of Mayday Hills had already been cemented. It was known widely as one of the most haunted places in Australia. Today, parts of the asylum have been converted into a hotel and a university campus. Guests can stay in the former nurses' quarters and walk the same halls as the patients once did. This blending of the past and present creates a unique and unsettling dynamic. Some guests check out early, unable to handle the oppressive feeling in their rooms. They report waking up to see dark figures standing at the foot of their beds. The mundane activity of a hotel operates alongside the paranormal activity of the asylum. It is a place where holiday makers brush shoulders with the dead. One specific room in the complex is notorious for the sensation of being pushed. Visitors who enter this small office often feel a firm shove against their chest or back. There is no one there, yet the physical force is undeniable. It is believed to be the spirit of a particularly angry patient who does not want intruders in his space. Skeptics who have challenged this story have often left with bruises as proof of the encounter. The violence of the push suggests a spirit that is still capable of physical interaction. It is a warning that the entities here are not passive observers. The face in the window is another common phenomenon reported by those walking the grounds at night. People often see a pale face pressing against the glass of the upper floors. The expression is one of longing and despair, staring out at the freedom they can never have. When security guards investigate the locked rooms, they find nothing but dust and empty space. Photographs taken from the outside sometimes capture this anomaly, revealing a blur of white features. It is a heartbreaking reminder of the souls who spent their lives looking out from behind barriers. Phantom smells are a frequent occurrence, particularly the scent of tobacco and carbolic soap. The smell of soap is associated with the obsessive cleaning routines enforced by the matrons. It wafts through the corridors when no cleaning is taking place. The tobacco smoke is linked to the male wards, where smoking was one of the few luxuries allowed. These olfactory hallucinations bridge the gap between the past and present. They are sensory memories imprinted on the atmosphere of the asylum. It makes the history feel immediate and tangible. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP recordings, are commonly captured during ghost tour. Investigators ask questions into the silence and play back the audio to hear whispered responses. The voices are often rough and demanding, telling people to get out or leave them alone. Sometimes the voices call out the names of the people in the room. This direct interaction is terrifying for those who experience it. It suggests an intelligence that is aware of the current surroundings. The voices confirm that the silence of Mayday Hills is actually filled with chatter. The psychological weight of a visit to Mayday Hills often follows people home. Many report having nightmares for days after leaving the asylum. The dreams are vivid and disturbing, often involving being trapped or chased through endless corridors. It is as if the darkness of the place attaches itself to the visitor like a parasite. This lingering dread is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the haunting. It proves that the horror is not confined to the physical boundaries of the asylum. The experience leaves a mark on the psyche that is hard to shake. Skeptics often arrive at Beechworth expecting to find nothing but old buildings and tall tales. However, the sheer consistency of the reports forces many to reconsider their stance. The experiences are not limited to believers or those prone to suggestion. Hardened skeptics have fled rooms in terror, unable to explain what they saw or felt. The asylum has a way of stripping away defenses and exposing people to the impossible. It challenges the rational understanding of the world. The fear it induces is primal and undeniable. The town of Beechworth itself seems to live in the shadow of the asylum on the hill. The locals have their own stories passed down through generations about the strange goings-on. Some refuse to go near the grounds after dark, fearing what they might encounter. The asylum is woven into the fabric of the community, a dark thread in a historic tapestry. It serves as a constant reminder of the past that refuses to stay buried. The relationship between the town and the asylum is one of uneasy coexistence. One harrowing account involves a tour guide who was locking up the Greencoats wing alone. He heard heavy footsteps approaching him from the far end of the corridor. Thinking it was a straggler, he called out, but received no answer. The footsteps sped up, changing into a heavy run that thundered against the floorboards. He fumbled with his keys in a panic as the invisible runner closed the distance. Just as he slammed the door shut, he felt a massive impact against the wood from the other side. He never walked that wing alone again. The basement areas of the asylum are particularly oppressive, with low ceilings and no natural light. These spaces were used for storage and sometimes for punishing unruly patients. The air down here is stagnant and smells of damp earth and decay. It is in these subterranean levels that the darker energies seem to congregate. Shadows appear to detach themselves from the walls and move independently. The feeling of being watched is intense and predatory. Few people can tolerate remaining in the basements for more than a few minutes. Why do the spirits linger at Mayday Hills in such great numbers? It is believed that the sheer emotional intensity of the location acts as a battery for paranormal activity. The years of suffering, madness, and despair have charged the very stones of the building. This is known as the stone tape theory, where emotional events are recorded in the environment. The ghosts may be looping playbacks of past tragedies, repeating their actions endlessly, or they may be conscious entities trapped by their own confusion and trauma. The answer remains a mystery, buried with the dead. The legacy of Mayday Hills is a complex mix of heritage and horror. Efforts are being made to preserve the history of the institution and the stories of those who lived there. It is important to remember the patients, not just as ghosts, but as human beings who suffered. The ghost tour help to keep their memories alive, albeit in a macabre way. By telling their stories, we acknowledge their existence and their pain. The asylum stands as a monument to the fragility of the human mind. A final warning is always given to those who wish to explore the abandoned sanatorium. Never mock the spirits and never invite them to follow you. The entities at Mayday Hills have been known to attach themselves to disrespectful visitors. The barrier between their world and ours is thin in this place. To walk these halls is to step into a history that is still very much alive. The eyes of the asylum are always open, and they are always watching. You may leave Mayday Hills, but Mayday Hills may never leave you.